Republic is distinctly focused on the question of human nature and the question, what is it to be a human being? And that word, anthropos, human, comes up a lot in this book. But the conversation that gets them into that it comes up by a very specific turn. You remember at the end of book 4, Socrates and Glaucon basically agreed that they'd now completed the conversation they needed to have about showing that the just life was better. And Glaucon was very satisfied with that. And Socrates says, oh, but I want to go on and talk about a few more things. Because they'd seen that the nature of the soul is sort of intimately connected to the nature of the political regime. And so Socrates says, I want to look at, some real political regimes that are imperfect and look at the correlation of the souls of the people who live in them with those regimes. And so he's going to have that conversation. And in fact, they do have a version of that conversation in book 8. But before they can do that, book 5 starts. And what happens is Polemarchus, who we haven't seen since book 1 really, intervenes and whispers something to Adeimantus. And then Adeimantus interrupts Socrates and says, yeah, we've got to talk about something else first. And so he says, this is at 449c, in our opinion, you're taking it easy and robbing us of a whole section of the argument. You thought you could get away with it by saying, as though it were something quite ordinary, that, after all, it's plain to everyone that, as for women and children, the things of friends will be in common. Well, he's referring back to a remark that Socrates made in book 4 at 423 D and E. He's not reproducing it exactly, and the differences are sort of relevant. But anyway, what Socrates actually said is, if by being well educated they become sensible men, they'll easily see to all this and everything else we're now leaving off, that the possession of women, marriage, and procreation of children must, as far as possible, be arranged according to the proverb that friends have all things in common. I think it's a little bit different to say that you said that everybody's going to have women and children in common, and Socrates says these things are going to be arranged according to the proverb that friends have things in common, since proverbs require a bit of interpretation and insight to make sense of. But in any case, that's the thing he's referring to. And so now the first 2/3 of book 5 are the discussion of that theme. And that discussion then leads very specifically into discussion of women, families, children, and also slaves, and the relation of all of those things to politics. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And in doing that, we're going to see the theme of nature, or physis, is pretty powerfully raised, and we're going to have to think about that. The nature of names or language, again, it's going to come up, and the nature of necessity is going to come up. So those are the things we're going to talk about, but we'll turn first to the issue of women. So the specific question that they're going to answer is whether women can and should be guardians. You remember that guardians, to be a guardian is like the highest human thing. The specific job of the guardians is to be craftsmen of the city's freedom. Right? They have the highest job of protecting the human community in the richest sense. And for that, they also need then the best education. So, should women be educated, and should they take on these highest jobs? The answer, of course, is going to be yes. But they get into that, talking about the guardians, by repeating the sort of comparison with guardians they made before with guard dogs. And Socrates asked Glaucon, if you're raising guard dogs, do you treat the male and the female dogs differently? And, or is it the case that the female dogs need to be trained basically the same as the male ones? And Glaucon says at 451d, right, he says they have education, everything in common, except that we use the females for weaker things. But he says everything in common, and I noticed that particular expression because one of the things you'll see throughout this is that language of in common gets played out in many different ways, both showing the richness of that word, but also showing the sort of ambiguity and complexity of that. And so it's not showing, in other words, that it's not so obvious what it means to say all these things are going to be done in common. It could mean a lot of different things, right? But in any case, that's what Glaucon says. So with dogs, you should treat the male and the female the same way. And so then Socrates asks the question about people. So he says at 452 E and the beginning of 453A. So mustn't we first come to an agreement whether these things are possible or not, and give anyone who wants to dispute the opportunity to dispute, and this is their issue, whether female human nature can share in common with the nature of the male class in all deeds or in none, etc., etc. And so the thing I want to really emphasize there, we know that's the question, but the thing I want to emphasize is that he specifically says the human nature, physis he anthropine, of the woman. And so here and throughout, as I said, that thing is being underlined, that we're talking about humans. So that's where they pose the specific question. Anyway, they then say, should we give the critic a chance to respond? And so then, sort of being the devil's advocate, they speak in the name of someone who might oppose this. And the objection that they present is based on that on the theme of nature, and they base it on the very argument that they've been using since the beginning of Book 2, right at 453b. Right after that, they imagine someone saying, "Well, you said that each one is supposed to mind his or her own business, right? Do his own thing, to how to pratain, according to nature, kataphusin. And so, since women are by nature different than men, they should do different things, right? That's the argument that's made, and surely you've heard that argument before. So it's nothing particularly distinctive about that being, 5th century Athens, BC. You hear that argument all the time. The thing that's interesting is that when Socrates says, okay, so how are we going to respond to that, Glaucon? And Glaucon says, on the spur of the moment, it's not very easy to answer that. So the thing I want you to notice there is that again shows you something about Glaucon. I imagine that most people listening to this in 2021 wouldn't be that hard pressed to come up with an answer to why women should be treated the same way as men, should get the same kind of education, and so on. They're raising the question. Glaucon's very open to this and interested in it, but he doesn't immediately see how to oppose the idea that since women are different from men, they should do different things. But then Socrates gives the answer, and it's a pretty familiar one, right? He and what he does is he uses that notion of qua that came up in Book 1, right? The notion that Thrasymachus raised of talking about something in the precise sense. Thrasymachus was saying the ruler qua ruler doesn't make mistakes about his own best interests. Socrates said, well, the doctor qua doctor is not a moneymaker, and so on. Ignoring the details of that particular argument, the point is they brought out that notion of talking about the relevant sense of the thing. And so Socrates then says at 454e, so we will assert that it has not thereby been proved that a woman differs from a man with respect to what we're talking about. Right? So that's the qua, right? So with respect to the issue of being a guardian, that difference between men and women, namely that women give birth to children, and men don't, that's irrelevant, right? So when they've gone through the objection, remember, somebody said, don't they differ by nature? And what do you pull out? Well, you pull out, that, women have ovaries or something like that. And Socrates says, it's like saying people are bald or they have, long hair. Like, yeah, some people are bald and some people have long hair. And that's true, but that's irrelevant to the question of whether they can take on this task of being a guardian. And he says that's the same point about men and women. So, again, for people in 2021, that should be a very familiar argument. But for Glaucon, it seems like it's pretty novel. Anyway, that leads Socrates to just bring up a few other themes. One is he emphasizes this importance of not getting hung up on names or just on words, right? So he says, you can make a dispute just based on a word or a name where you don't really engage with the substance. So yes, it's correct to say that women are different from men. And then you can say, well, things that are different have to have different things, and so they can't both be guardians, right? That would be sort of the argument. But there, that word different is functioning in the argument, or the putative argument, in a misleading way. Because the sense in which they're different is not the same as the sense in which they need to have different tasks, because the relevant task you're talking about doesn't pertain to that difference, right? So Socrates says when you make arguments that are based on playing with the words without really grasping what's being said in the words, that's what he calls heuristic, or competitive debate, or sophistical debate, as opposed to true engagement with the matter in hand to try to understand something about the situation. And that's what he calls dialectic. That's the language from 454a. He says about these other people, they pursue contradiction in the mere name of what's being spoken about, using heuristic, not dialectic, with one another. So I wanted to bring that out because, as I said, the theme of names or language runs throughout this. And one of the things that you're seeing there is that language has the capacity to do a couple of different things. It has the capacity to be that which we employ in our engagement with each other to, get to the truth, to get more deeply into things. But it can also be that which we use to do the exact opposite, to say things that precisely don't get involved with the things, but where you just sort of play in the terms of language itself to reach conclusions that are actually false. So that's one thing that comes out of this exchange. But then, getting back to the theme of women and human nature and so on, Socrates uses this point that we've just made, where the person who's objecting to the idea that women should have education or should be able to be in the highest positions, that person has tried to invoke the argument Socrates brought out in Book 2, that each person should mind his or her own business, tahou tu pratein, according to nature, kataphusin. And he says, well, they said the same words that we said in Book 2, but did they mean the same thing by those words, right? There again, was that heuristic or dialectic? And so Socrates then goes back to revisit those points he made in Book 2 and says, just what did we mean when we said that a person should do the thing that he or she, I guess, he said he at the time, that would naturally suited to. Well, actually, he said each. So I don't know that it was always distinguished as male, but sometimes it was, for sure. Anyway, so at 455b, he says, "Come now, is this what we meant? Did you distinguish between the man who has a good nature for a thing and another who has no nature for it on these grounds, that one learns something connected with that thing easily, the other with difficulty, that one, starting from slight learning, is able to carry discovery far forward in the field he has learned, while the other, having chanced on a lot of learning and practice, can't even preserve what he learned. And the bodily things give adequate service to the thought of the man with the good nature, while they oppose the thought of the other man. Are there any other things than these that by which you distinguish the man who has a good nature for each discipline from the one who doesn't?" No. So the point is, there he's saying, look, the only sense in which we were saying you should do what you're suited to by nature is saying you should do what you're good at. You should do what fits. And that's found out by you, by whether it works when you try to do it. Do you find that you want to play volleyball, and yet your body just doesn't do the things you need it to do when you want to serve or whatever it is, right? The bodily things just don't really answer to your desires that well. Or do you find that you want to be a musician, but you can study and study and study that stuff, and you can't make anything sound good? Whereas some other people, they just pick up the whatever it is, the trumpet or something, and they get a little bit of lesson, and they immediately make beautiful music. Some people do well at some things and not well at others, and the thing is, you would do well to do what fits, and what fits, and also therefore presumably is satisfying, and all the rest. So Socrates makes clear here that nature, talking about people doing what comes to them by nature, is a description of how you find your experience unfolding, and it makes no claim about some metaphysical predisposition to something or anything like that. That saying people should do what suits them by nature is a matter of saying you should do what you find fits you and what works well. And he says, so if anybody is thinking that they can talk about what people have to do by nature in a way different from that, then there's something really wrong, right? And that's what's been happening in the case of people who say women by nature are not allowed to do these things. And so then he says, so really what that leads us to see is something about the city nowadays, right, that Glaucon had been interested in from the beginning. He says, rather, the way things are nowadays proves to be against nature. And so remember, the objector was saying, we need things to be organized according to nature, and therefore women cannot get education and they cannot do these important public things. And Socrates says, that's not doing things according to nature, that is going against nature. That's a real misunderstanding of what human nature is. And that relates to another point. A little bit earlier, they were saying, if women are going to do gymnastic exercise, which means in part means doing things naked, he says, are people going to laugh at that? And they say, yeah, it's going to be ridiculous. Ha ha ha, laugh, laugh, laugh. And Socrates says, well, yeah, people might find that ridiculous, but it was not that long ago that people found the idea of men exercising naked ridiculous. But now we Greeks do that. People don't find it ridiculous at all. They're used to it. And so the question of what seems ridiculous or what seems against nature, in those contexts, has a lot more to do with habituation than nature. And so when people then think that the idea that women doing these things would be ridiculous, that is not evidence of them looking at things the way they naturally should be. That's just them reflecting their habits. That's them reflecting what the system is that they got used to. And in fact, the system, as we've seen, is a system that is against nature, not according to nature. So that's the first thing they talk about in book 5, and they're bringing out something about human nature, but it's especially interesting to see how Socrates is really showing that notion of human nature is a powerful resource for a kind of political critique, and this is the first part of that. So now let's go on and look at the issue of the family. So the second big topic they deal with is basically the removing of the normal structure of the family, and indeed redefining family relationships entirely in terms of their utility for the city. This section begins again with the use of the language of in common, but those terms are used with a slightly different meaning than they were just used with before. So this is at 457 C to D. Socrates says, all these women will be for all these men in common, and no woman is to live privately with any man, and the children, in their turn, will be in common, and neither will a parent know his own offspring, nor a child his parent. That's what they're going to talk about. But before getting into any detail about how they actually then take that up, I want to look at the remark that Socrates makes leading into this conversation. So he says, do me this favor and let me take a holiday, like the idle men who are accustomed to feast their minds for themselves when they walk along. Such men, before finding out in what way something they desire can exist, put that question aside so that they won't grow weary deliberating about what's possible or not. They set down as given the existence of what they want, and at once go on to arrange the rest and enjoy giving a full account of the sort of things they'll do when it has come into being, making yet idler a soul that is already idle. Well, Socrates says that's what he's going to do. So I want to bring out 2 points about that. First, I want you to see how much that defines what's coming. This conversation that you're about to hear is one that Socrates says is not founded on proper method, but is instead the way idle people talk, and it's a way that idle people talk to make themselves yet idler. But the thing he says you should do is first investigate the possibility of things. And I want to remind you now that we talked about that very issue way back in Book 2. So do you remember in Book 2, Glaucon introduced his thought experiment. And he said, we're going to think through something like this. And the question I raised at the time is it a well-designed thought experiment? Right. That was back at 359 B and C, where he introduced it, and the conversation carried on to 362 C in book 2. And I said, well, yeah, you can pose this question, but did Glaucon ever do the work of seeing if the thing he's setting up makes sense? It seems to me he doesn't. And I contrasted that with what Socrates does right after, when he tells Glaucon and Adeimantus how he's going to think about things. And that's in book 2 at 369b. And that's where he said, the city, as I believe, comes into being because none of us is self-sufficient and each of us is in need of much. And then he went on to talk about the city. But the thing is, what Socrates did was define the principle out of which a city comes into being. The principle is that which gives rise to cities and really makes them possible. It's why they do exist and why they can exist. Right? So in book 2, we saw a very different approach that Socrates takes, it seems to me, compared to the one Glaucon takes. And here, Socrates, again, it seems to me, is thematizing exactly the same thing. What it is to do a competent job of investigating something versus what it is to do something that has no real weight. So I want you to look at that. And I want to just add one other thing. Again, if you're thinking about Socrates' relationship to these issues, you go back even a little bit earlier at the very beginning of book 2 book 5, when Adeimantus was first saying to Socrates that he wanted him to talk about this issue that had been raised about women and children being dealt with according to the proverb that friends have all things in common. And Socrates said, well, I was reluctant to talk about that because it's a complex sort of thing. And he said at 451a about the things he's going to say, I prostrate myself before Adrastea, Glaucon, for what I'm going to say. And his point is, the things I'm going to say to you are not things about which I can turn around and say, yes, I think these things are right and compelling. And he says, if I could talk to you that way, I wouldn't worry about it. But here I'm going to be talking about things that aren't like that. And so I might actually be doing you damage by you thinking about these things. You could think further about the specifics of that if you want. Like, all I want to bring out there is this idea that from the start, Socrates has been underlining, you can't just take these accounts and lift them off the page. And I think that remark there about Adrastea should be compared with something that Socrates says in the Phaedrus. In the Phaedrus, Phaedrus gives this speech about love that really says you shouldn't care about people, you should just use sex instrumentally and blah, blah, blah. And Socrates ends up taking that very speech that Phaedrus gave and saying, well, maybe that could be done a little better, and gives his version of it. But then he says, man, I just committed an offense because I put your speech into better words, but that's a speech that shouldn't be made. And I really offended against the gods by saying something that's really false. And so then he goes on to make another speech that he calls a palinode, the taking back song, where he says, that thing I said was wrong, but here's what love really is. And it's one of the greatest things in Plato's writing, this great speech about Eros. The thing I wanted you to notice there is Socrates, in a very similar way, saying, like, the thing I spoke is an offense, and in this case he says I should be punished for it if it's wrong, and in the other case he said I need to atone for it. So I want you to first of all draw your attention to this remark for the reason that it involves a significant kind of distancing regarding what's about to be said, but also because the particular theme it emphasizes is the necessity of identifying the possibility of the thing before you go on to talk about it, which is an issue we will revisit. In any case, what do they then go on to say? Well, they're basically going to talk about breeding. That's probably the biggest issue at first is, how you're going to put children together or parents together to make the best children. this is the thing that they have not really sorted out the possibility of first. They're just going to say it works, right? That discussion of breeding is throughout sort of premised on treating people like they're other kinds of animals. Back at 451c, at the very beginning, when he was going to talk about this topic, about how they're going to deal with women and children, he said, okay, for human beings, and again, that's anthropos is the word he uses there, for human beings born and educated as we described, there's not going to be any right acquisition and use of children or women other than they're following upon that path that we directed them. So we could ask ourselves exactly what that is. But then he says, okay, so presumably we attempted in the argument to establish the men as guardians of a herd. Of a herd? Is that the way to think about the city? Right? There's it was a very animal word being used to describe who the guardians are supposed to guard. So that's interesting. And again, Socrates then compared the guardians to guard dogs at 451d, right after that, when they were then raising this question of women and whether women should be educated. He raised the question of guard dogs and said, do they need the same education? And then he said, do people of the females with human nature, should they be educated the same way? So he asked the question about dogs, and then he asked, is the same thing true of women? But the question was launched through this theme of dogs. And in that comparison of human guardians with guard dogs was also twice used in Book 2 when they were first introduced. At 375a, when they first start talking about their spirited nature, and then at 375d and e, when they're talking about loyalty and so on. Guard dogs were repeatedly used in the comparison. And then again here, now when they get to breeding at 459a, Socrates talks about the breeding of hunting dogs and horses. Right? So we've been watching over these pages while these issues have been developing, constant references and comparisons to dogs and so on, without ever asking that question, is it possible? Is this the right comparison? But so then, at 459b, Socrates says, so Glaucon will need eminent leaders, etc., if it's the same with the human species, taton anthropon genos. So, and Glaucon says, of course it is. So they've been raising this issue of the breeding of dogs to make the best ones, and he says, so that's what we're going to need if it's the same with humans, right? And Glaucon says, of course it is. Is it? I don't think so. But that's what this thing rests on, is Glaucon here identifying the possibilities in human nature with those in the natures of non-human animals. So those things I'd want you to focus on if you're trying to think about how to relate to the material that's described here, especially in terms of that issue of possibility that Socrates raises. But anyway, what do they end up doing? Well, they end up, eliminating sort of all these family structures. But what that really accomplishes is that kind of by negative means, they show you what a family is. Right? So they end up talking about spouses, children, other relatives, and the thing that they're really emphasizing is that in each case, these relationships are relationships that someone has to some other particular set of people, right? Where there are some people that are singled out as our people, mom and dad, son and daughter, grandpa, whatever, uncle. These are the particular ones who are our people, as opposed to the others. So first of all, there's that issue of particularity. Second, they bring out that the people have very, very strong affective bonds to those people. So that's that. So first it's people, who are particular people that we have affective bonds to. And then beyond that, the same kinds of issues come up with property. And property takes different forms. Like on the one hand, it means private possessions. But it also means a place. It means your house, but also the house, but I guess I would say the home. Like, what place is yours? So it's what people are yours, what things are yours, and what place is yours. And so there, it seems to me Socrates' discussion is really showing you the dimensions of the family that make for you the experience of your own. And that's exactly what they say. They say the development of the family produces in us this experience of my own, that basically defines you by ties that could conflict to your ties with the city. And that seems to me a really powerful investigation into this question or into this issue of how we develop a sense of my own. That theme of my own especially then comes up at around 462C. And there I think you might compare that discussion with a couple of questions that were asked earlier. Very early on at 449D, Adeimantus had talked about this discussion they want to have about women and children and so on. And he said there that talking about these issues make a big difference, or rather the whole difference, in whether a regime is going to be right or not. So the point I want to make is just that this issue of what happens in the family with women and children being raised is what makes all the difference. And then Glaucon said something different but related at 450C. He said, we want to know about the children when you're young, because he said in the time between birth and education, that more formal stuff that we already talked about, he says that's the time that seems to be the most trying. Yeah, no doubt it's difficult to raise little children in certain ways, but the point is they're really thematizing this period. And I think if you compare those comments with this stuff that's coming out here now at 462C, there you see that what's really being formed is that sense of my own. So I want to reflect now on what I think the significance of this discussion that they have here about the family is for issues of politics. So let's step back from the text for a minute and just reflect on the nature of the city. The city, the polis, is a historical reality. It's something that emerged in time. In particular, it emerged in Greece over a space of a few hundred years, from roughly, 900 BC to about 400 BC, right? Which is to say the time of Socrates. That end is the time of Socrates. And as I said when we were talking about Book 2, Socrates is talking about the city or the polis. When he first talks about it, he really seems to be using that word to mean very generically human society. And that is a legitimate use of that Greek word. But that word came to have a very specialized meaning, which is what I'm going to talk about. And that's really what Socrates means too. And what it meant is the self-governing city-state. We say city-state because the state names that idea of a self-governing unit. And the relevant thing is that it's at the level of the city that it was a state, as opposed to a nation state in the modern world or something like that. So the polis came to mean the city as a self-governing community. What's interesting about that is that it is a community of people. In particular, it's more or less a peasant community, making decisions for itself about how it's going to live. And that's in contrast to situations where, a human society understands itself to be, something answering to a god who speaks through a god king to whom all the people are subject, something like that. So there have always been situations of rule in the world. But this thing that happened in Greece was new in the world, right? The idea that there's a community of people who organize themselves and make decisions for themselves through, talking with each other about how they're going to live. Right? Aristotle puts that quite well in Book 1, Chapter 2 of the Politics. He says, what happens in the polis is that people get together and they use their ability to think and talk with each other to collectively discuss what is just and what is unjust. And in light of that, I guess, to talk about what is expedient for the city and what is inexpedient for the city. Right? So the thing about a political community is that people get together and they use their own individual powers of thinking and speaking to talk with each other about what their primary values are and what their policies should be. And so by the time of the Republic, which, people can debate about when the drama is set, but I think it's 421 BC, but there are other possibilities, but somewhere around there. At that time, this conversation is taking place in kind of the high point of Athenian democracy. So the polis in that technical sense of the self-governing peasant community developed, a lot over that, let's say 500 years from 900 to 400. But here, we're kind of at the end of that, when these communities, or Athens in particular, had become pointedly democratic. There had been a series of political revolutions, each of which really broadened the body of people, basically in terms of economic class, who could participate in that decision-making process for the city, right? Who could be part of the self that's self-governing. And so that democracy is kind of the far end, or the most developed end of this meaning of the polis, or the political community. That's where Socrates and Glaucon and Adeimantus are. They're at that point where basically people in Athens, down to wage laborers, can be part of the assembly debating about city policy and so on. But so the thing that's really noticeable about that is that didn't just happen happily and easily. That happened in a context of great conflict. And the real conflict was between this notion of democracy, this notion of a community that has a very broad base making decisions for itself, where people are thinking about the good of the community, that model, fighting with the model of traditional aristocratic families. There had been powerful aristocratic families who wanted to have power and hand it down to their children and continue to have power. They want power to be defined on family lines. Which family has the power? And so the city, the polis, came into being really by challenging that in two pretty big ways. One, literally trying to limit family power. Right? But then second, also by trying to develop the idea that who you are is primarily a citizen rather than a family member, or more so than a family member. Right? Because when you have people coming to the assembly or whatever to debate about what to do, what you want is for them to be debating about what's good for the city, not what's good for their family. Right? And that's the big change that has to happen for you truly to have a political community. Right? People have to come together as citizens, that is to say, as representatives of the city, and as individuals use their powers to think about matters and to debate about them and so on. So this notion of the political community is really defined as a challenge to the notion of the family and to the notion of the primacy of family membership. And what it proposes instead is that who you are is a citizen. And so in that context, where you have citizens are all the same. We're all equal as representatives of the city. And the Spartans called the citizens. The Spartans had an extremely narrow view of who could be a citizen. They are the group, they are the city that believed the citizens were only the guardians, as in the language of the Republic. And that didn't include people who had trades, certainly didn't include manual laborers, didn't include slaves, etc., etc. In Athens, that notion is much broader. But in any case, the Spartans had a name for citizens. They called them homoioi, right? The same ones. And that's really worth noticing, right? In the city where you're a citizen, you're all the same. You're all equal. You're all equal, basically as single individuals. The primary unit is not the family, with its differentiated members. Are you the mom or the dad, the sister or the brother or whatever, but rather the family with its individual members, each of whom is the same as the other. Right? So now let's just think about that basic thing and relate it back to the text. I mean, what Book 5 really shows you, at least in this part that Socrates refers to as the second wave, the second big issue they're going to deal with, what it really shows you is the antagonism of the family and the city. Right? That's really the point that's being made there. And the reason is exactly the one I was basically naming just now. Right? The question is, what are you going to think of as your own? Where is your loyalty going to be? Right? So the real issue is this deep conflict of loyalties between your sense of being a family member and your sense of belonging to the city. Right? And the aristocratic families want you to say family first. And the self-governing political community wants you to say city first. Right? And that's a real issue in ancient Greece, and it's by definition a real issue for the city. The city as such, the political community as such, has an inherently polemical or antagonistic relationship to the family. Not necessarily in the sense that it doesn't want families to exist, but in the sense that it is challenging the family for the role of being the primary center of loyalty. Right? That conflict is really powerfully dramatized in Sophocles' tragedy Antigone. I have another lecture on YouTube about that you can look at if you want. You should certainly read the play. That issue comes up again in Pericles' funeral oration in Book 2 of Thucydides when he's talking about Athens. And he says there, what he really wants is for people to develop eros for their city. Usually you have eros for your spouse, or erotic passion for your spouse. And he says you should have it for your city, right? He's saying he wants you to take those attitudes you normally direct elsewhere, those deep affective bonds you have for your intimate companions, and relate to the city that way. Right? So those texts, the Antigone play and Pericles' speech, really, it seemed to me, underline this idea that there is a deep issue in you as a person with who you or what you are going to feel primarily loyal to. Right? It's not just a conceptual matter. It's a matter of your lived sense of who you are. And so, Socrates says that the real issue is developing a kind of community of pleasure and pain. That's at 462b. Because the point is, in a family, you do feel pained. Like you're directly, affectively moved by the things that happen to the people you care intimately about. And, Pericles' point about wanting you to love the city is saying you need to feel similarly moved by what happens to people in your city. And of course, you see that in the contemporary day. People get really charged up. In the United States, you see this commonly. It's like, oh, everything was fine until an American got killed in that conflict. And then people are riled up, right? They don't know that person. The person isn't part of their family. But it's an American. And because they feel affectively their sense of identity with America, they feel themselves to be hurt when that person was hurt. And so, in general, it's going to be inherent to a political community to try to cultivate feelings of loyalty for that political community. Feelings of, in the modern day, feelings of nationalism. In these days, feelings of cityism, right? In Socrates' days. So what you really want is for people to live with a sense of an identity in common. And I'll just remind you, that was that language that Socrates introduced when he said, we're going to be thinking about the proverb that friends have all things in common. And we've been looking at this notion of in common. Well, there's something profoundly important about that sense of having a common identity, an identity in common with all the other people in your political community. So that's what has really been going on here. And I want to draw your attention then to a particular passage. This is at 462c. And, so this is where Socrates has just been, saying the city needs to challenge the ways that on the basis of family membership, people say my own in ways that are different from each other. So he says, is then the city in which most say my own and not my own about the same thing and in the same way the best governed city? By far, Glaucon says. And so he says, then is that city best governed which is most like a single human being? Now I want you to notice what he says about a single human being. For example, when one of us wounds a finger, presumably the entire community, which is to say the community tying the body together with the soul in a single arrangement under the ruler within it, that entire community is aware of the fact, and all of it is in pain as a whole along with the afflicted part. Right, what he's saying is, you are a community, but when your finger is hurt, you feel it. It's not like you say, oh, too bad finger. The shoulder doesn't say too bad finger. I don't care about you. The finger and the shoulder are the same. They're you, right? And you feel as a whole in all of these different parts of yourself, right? And he says, and it is in this sense that we say that this human being has a pain in his finger, right? And just think of those words. This human being, again, that language, the single human being, the henos anthropon that he said in the first line here, this human being has a pain in his finger. Those are the relationships that define you and your body, right? And he says, and does the same relationship hold for any other part of a human being? Same word. Both when it is afflicted by pain and when eased by pleasure. The thing I want you to notice out of that, that's a very important analysis for all kinds of reasons, and it connects quite strongly and directly with the theme that came up in book 4 when we were talking about conflict in the soul, and the point was we're talking about the same himself when you're struggling with your own desires. Very, very similar point. But the thing that I want you really just to notice is the fact of emphasizing the single human being. Right? What this shows you is that experientially, you do live as an I, as a my own or as a myself. And that, in a way, is what the city is about. The city is about recognizing the kind of ontological integrity of the single human being, in contrast to the family, really, which doesn't say you're a single human being who therefore could be anyone. It says you are the daughter. Right? Family relationships define you out of roles. The city takes you out of that role and says the role does not define you. And the city recognizes only individual human beings. I say it recognizes that only, and in a sense that is a limitation, I suppose. But it's also a pretty big advance. Like, it recognizes something about you that you might really want to have recognized that isn't recognized elsewhere. And when you get together in the assembly, you use, as Aristotle says, you use your logos, you use your individual powers of thinking to try to figure out issues, and you express your single opinion. Right? So the singleness of the individual as a unified experiencing one, a unified experiencing agent that has its own point of view and its own opinions, right? That's what the city recognizes. And in a sense, then, you could say the city is the context that allows us to assume that identity. Right? The city is the context that allows that interpretation of ourselves to hold sway. So that, I think, is really the big kind of accomplishment of this analysis in the second wave. It's to show two things that I've tried to bring out in what I've been saying. Two things that are both extremely important and maybe not that easily put together in us. That on the one hand, the family, with its particular relationships to other people, to things, and to a place, is kind of the generative matrix of your sense of your own, of who you are. And that's really important. And yet, on the other hand, the city is the context or the place that recognizes you and allows you to be a self-defined individual who thinks for him or herself. So these are two things that are brought out, it seems to me, through that analysis of the second wave. Both very important. And there is a really rich and significant tension. I want to just say one more thing about this section, and that is, take these things I've just been saying and ask, how are you going to think about them? Well, I'm talking to you in 2021. We've all lived in political communities for, a long time. We're very familiar with this idea of the single individual, especially, since, 1600 and the development of these notions of the rights of the individual. We're really familiar with that way of thinking and that way of talking and so on. So in some ways, it's more of a struggle for us to think about what it's like to be in a family and to think about the relationships in family life and so on that aren't exactly recognizing us as discrete self-governing individuals. And because we take that notion of the self-governing individual so much for granted, that just who we are, that we don't see that we can live our identities in different ways, right? Well, in Socrates' conversation with Glaucon in 421 BC, it seems like the issue is the opposite, right? The polis, the political community that we so much take for granted, is something that's just being invented. They're inventing it. And those guys, Glaucon and Socrates, are living in that thing in its richest development. But they're living in a world that has really defined itself by the family and things like that for a long, long time. And so another thing that you see, it seems to me, in Book 5, in the second wave discussion of Book 5, is the attempt to talk about these issues I was just talking about, sort of through the lens of the relationships and structures you understand in family life. So basically, it's as if they say, well, being a citizen is like having everyone as your brother. That's not so unfamiliar. If you remember the French Revolution, they were after liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? Their attempt to define a community based on a sense of the rights of the individual still relied on that notion, that family notion of brotherhood, and indeed the masculine notion of brotherhood, to try to talk about what they meant by a citizen. So here, what you're seeing in the second wave of Book 2 is this idea that what you think of as a family, that's got to be expanded. But the analysis also draws your attention to the idea that you can't just expand it, because it's the very meaning of family membership that this is our family, you're not part of it, that's your family, I'm not part of it, right? Family membership is about particular groups that are ours, as opposed to other particular groups. Whereas the city is about us all having the same one, right? So there's something, you can see a sense both to the notion of expanding the sense of those relationships, like talking about a universal brotherhood, but you can also see how in doing that, you're kind of denying half of the very meaning of the thing, because there's something non-universalizable about those relationships. So we got to the point of talking about the single human being. And I want just to think about that, about what it is to be a single human being and what the relevant part of that is here. From the point of view of what I was saying about the city, the relevant part about being a single human being is, thinking of Aristotle's remark, that you participate in the deliberations about what's good and what's expedient and so on. And so notice that from the point of view of the discussion of the division of the soul in Book 4, the relevant thing there is the part that they there called logismos, or calculation. Now, as I said at the time, we're going to need to think a little bit more about what the proper way is to think about that aspect of ourselves. And in fact, that's going to be our focus in the next lecture when we look at the end of Book 5 and the thing Socrates calls the third wave, which is when we'll really get into the discussion of the philosopher. But the point I want to make here is just that is the part that really stands out here, and we've seen something about that. So that's the thing that characterizes the human being, which is why the women need to be educated and they can play the role of guardians and be craftspeople of the city's freedom. And it's also why the individual participates in the city not as a family member and so on. Right? It is also the thing that's particularly relevant to a couple of points that have come up before, right? The issues that Socrates raised here, or the ideas that Socrates employed in making his points, were that notion of the qua, or the insofar as, in the first wave, and he raised that issue of possibility in the second wave. And those are really matters of understanding. And those are integral parts of whatever that aspect of ourselves is that deals with calculation and so on. So we'll go on to look at that further. But I want to bring out one other thing about this point. And that is that, Socrates throughout this book has been emphasizing anthropos, right? Our capacities and powers as human beings. Right? And that's what we're just talking about right here. Once you focus on the human being, the question of whether you're a man or a woman isn't really relevant to these political and educational issues. Similarly, what family you belong to doesn't matter, because it's about you as a single human being. Well, notice that the very next part of that conversation, still in the context of this second wave, involves talking about the relationship between Greeks and barbarians. And Glaucon ends up agreeing to this idea that, you treat the barbarians very differently than the Greeks. And I don't think that makes sense. I think, given the very things we've been establishing about anthropos, it doesn't make sense that the rules are going to be different for Greeks and for barbarians. And it comes up in a few different ways, but the most pronounced one is slaves. You can't have other Greeks as slaves. But you can have barbarians. It seems to me that distinction suffers in the same way that distinction between man and woman did in the first section. In the Meno, a very similar thing comes up. Socrates is talking to Meno, a wealthy aristocrat, and they're talking about what virtue is, and Meno's view is, there's a virtue for the man, which is going out and being tough, It's a virtue for the woman, which is doing domestic work, a virtue for the slave, a virtue for the child. So Meno starts out very much with the view that it seems to me lies behind this discussion in Book 5 of the Republic, right? That there is a difference in nature between man, woman, child, and slave. And the point Socrates is making here is those are all human beings. That's what their nature is. So yes, there are differences between men and women, grown-ups and children, and I suppose Greeks and barbarians. But they don't change what the issue is. I mean, if we're going to talk in the language of the Meno, they wouldn't change what the issue is of the virtue of that person, because virtue is the excellent development of your nature, and those things have the same nature. So in the Meno, Socrates makes a very similar point, right? He talks to a slave, and in talking to that slave, makes it clear that slave is capable of grasping, the mathematical relationships, profound mathematical relationships. In other words, that slave has exactly the same capacities as any of the other human beings we're talking about here. And indeed, Socrates singles out in the conversation with Meno, I guess you never gave this guy any education, eh? And Meno's like, yeah, why would I give him any education? But so Socrates, it seems to be in the Meno, is making the point that that Meno has this view that there are these people with different natures who therefore have different sort of proper fulfillments. Socrates is challenging that view and precisely showing that the person who's kind of lowest on Meno's scale, the slave has exactly the capacities that are uniquely definitive of human beings. Anyway, that point, it seems to me, is very much the kind of point that's being made here. And it should have implications for the discussion of whether or not barbarians can be slaves, just as it has implications for whether or not women can be guardians. So I want to conclude now just by going back and thinking a little bit about what we've been doing in the book so far and how some of the ideas that come out of book 5 can lead us to reflect back on those things. So, I'll remind you again, at the beginning of book 4, Adeimantus referred to the guardians as those to whom the city in truth belongs. And, I was saying that, that really is reminiscent of kind of the attitude of Sparta, the Spartans, where the only citizens were really warriors. And they had these people they called the perioikoi, people who, lived around, but who had no rights in the city as such. Like they weren't making decisions. But who were those people? Well, those were the tradespeople. Those were the people who did the economic work of the city. Right? And so, and Socrates responds to Adeimantus by saying, we're actually not looking for, making things great for one particular class. We're trying to make things good for the city as a whole. So, if you think about that and go back to his beginning when he says the city in truth comes out of, our need to cooperate and share, Socrates is really saying the city is and the city depends upon primarily the work and the creative work of these people who are being refused political recognition in these other states. Right? So that was the big move in Athens, was to, grant citizenship rights to those very people. So Socrates, in his whole account of the city, is kind of giving an economic critique almost of the of sort of that Spartan idea, right? And showing this relationship of dependency upon this creative work, and saying like those people, those are the real city. So that that's already pretty powerful and important and very interesting. But remember, I pointed out when we talked about that he says that the city of utmost necessity is a city of 4 or 5 men. He doesn't really talk about families, even though that might be implied in what he says. He doesn't actually talk about it. He acts as if, in talking about it, there are just men who are farmers. There are just men who are, house builders. Right? So that removes that man from the context of his immediate family in the sense of his spouse and children. But it also removes him from the context of the family in the sense of the context in which he came into being. Right? It starts with that man given as fully there and existing, without, as Socrates said here, without accounting for the possibility of that. So you give a story in which you put these existing men doing this work and say what happens. But then the question is, well, what does it take for those people to be there? And, really, I think the answer is those people can be there only if there is the family, with its context of nurturance and so on, and indeed then before that, with its context of reproduction, sexual relationships and reproduction. So Socrates' account is in book 2 proves to be a very powerful critique of a kind of political view that only sees things from the point of view of, the ruling guardians. But what book 5, I think, really draws our attention to is that world itself is premised on something else that has not been accounted for, which is really the world of the coming into being of people through birth and through those basic sort of family relations and so on. And so there, I want to remind you of one other passage, right? When Socrates said, if we have these men and women doing their exercises together naked in the gymnasium, isn't their mixing just by a kind of internatural necessity going to produce sex? And Glaucon says, yes, there is a necessity of that, but we're not talking about geometrical necessities. We're talking about erotic necessities. In other words, there's something in our eros, in the nature of our desire, that's going to compel us to do those things, right? That's sort of Glaucon's point. The thing I think that is really you need to bring out of that is that notion of erotic necessity. Right? If you go back again to that beginning of Socrates' account in Book 2, he said people come together out of need. And the account of what has to be in the city and so on is going to be answerable to what human needs are. And so I think the thing you need to ask Socrates' account in the beginning of Book 2 is, has he adequately accounted for human need? Right? He says, well, you're going to have food, you're going to have shelter, you're going to have clothing, familiar things people say. And those things are all true enough. But those are the needs of life, of animal life. But Socrates makes very clear in the Apology that we shouldn't interpret a person just as someone who's alive, right? The thing about being a human is that what matters is what you take a stand on, and indeed, therefore, what you're prepared to die for. So life and death isn't what defines human life. So if Socrates was supposed to be giving an account of human need, and he only gave an account of the needs of biological life, it seems like something is really missing. Glaucon's remark here about erotic necessities, it seems to me, should really draw our attention to that. That there's something else we require in our lives beyond those things. And, I've been talking about birth and families as a big part of what clearly is a need of our lives. Again, that even just in a sort of biological sense, you got to be born and you got to be raised. But then I think, well, maybe there's more to that story of what we need that is really a sort of condition for human living, but that has not been accounted for in Socrates' account so far. So as we go on now to the final part of Book 5 and look at what he calls the third wave, it seems to me we're really going to be carrying two issues powerfully forward from what we've been talking about here. One is that issue of this, the part that does the calculating, that aspect of ourselves that does the calculating, that is so definitive of the human being, especially with respect to our participation in political life and so on, the part of the person that warrants being included in the city and being recognized as an individual. But I think we also need to carry forward this question about erotic necessities. What is the role of eros in our life, and what is its character? And so it's those ideas now that I'd like you to be thinking about as we move on to our next study.